So welcome to this session with Amanda and Anna, Making Sense of It All. We're going to have two data scientists from Quizlet share their learnings and around Quizlet and data science. And this presentation is going to be interactive. So rather than using the Q&A tool so that our wonderful data science team can see and the participation and engagement, use the chat box to engage with this presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda and Anna. Thank you so much.
All right, welcome everyone. So we're going to get started and Anna's going to share her screen. And so yeah, just welcome and thanks for coming today. So we're going to be talking about making sense of all, learning science, and Quizlet. So first, let's start with who are we? So next slide, Anna. So my name is Amanda Baker. I'm head of analytics here at Quizlet. I've been here for about 3 years. NorCal native, but learning to love SoCal now. I'm in Pasadena. Graduated a master's degree in space sciences, but switched into tech, and and feel really passionate about getting more girls into coding and science. So I'm a co-founder of our Women at Quizlet group, and yeah, excited to be with you guys here today. And go ahead, Anna.
Hey everyone, I'm Anna. I'm a data scientist here at Quizlet. I've been here almost a year now. I'm mostly Californian. Came over from Russia when I was a kid. Love both NorCal and SoCal. I wrapped up a PhD in cognitive neuroscience last year, and while I was a grad student, I really fell in love with teaching. I taught stats, learning and memory, other classes that I really loved putting together. And so I wanted to come to Quizlet and translate a lot of that great learning science into actionable insights that we can use in the real world. So that's why I'm here. And apologies for my cats if you hear them in the background. So to get us started, what is learning science? At Quizlet, we think of it broadly as the discipline where we can draw on rigorous research to help us determine the most effective and efficient ways to learn. And crucially, these methods have to generalize to real world situations. If they don't reproduce outside of the lab, they don't provide much value to our learners. So we really care that they generalize. So today we're going to focus on, first, the methods that we know are good ways to learn. And then we're going to transition to good ways to learn how to learn, because that's a challenge that a lot of our students struggle with. So to kick things off, I want us to reflect on ways that we've adopted learning science in our classrooms already. So how have any learning science findings made their way into your classroom and influenced the way you teach? Go ahead and answer in the chat.
Awesome. So I already see repetition, 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 retrieval practice. Awesome. Space practice. Love that. Daily learning, low stakes quizzes, practice. These are all great answers. Hands-on, visual learning, adaptive learning, storytelling, gamification. Awesome. You guys sound like you really are really on top of it with this learning science and adapting it to your classrooms. So that's awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. So keep those coming, but we really want to just highlight that our goal for today is to give you even more actionable and easy insights that you can take away and use right away with your students in the classroom. So we'll dig into some of those concepts a little more and hopefully teach you some new things along the way.
Okay, great. So learning science in the classroom. You know, one of the biggest contributions from learning science in the last decade has been this shift in how we think about testing. It's no surprise that testing is a tool that most teachers use. How else are you supposed to know when your students learn anything? And we all know that, you know, attending a class sometimes may not always be the same thing as being engaged in learning, as we've all had. You guys have all probably had those students who are maybe only slightly awake in the class. So testing is really critical. But testing does more than just help track your students' progress and help identify what concepts your students need a little more review on. A tremendous amount of learning actually occurs every time you try and pull out information out of your mind. And we're gonna show some studies that prove that a little bit later, but what we really wanna focus on and have you guys keep in your head and remember from this talk is that testing actually is learning. So some concrete examples of retrieval practice, as we call it, as some of you guys were talking about in the chat, retrieval practice. you may be familiar with are flashcards, low stakes quizzes, think, pair, share, brain dumps, you know, and these are the things that Quizlet tries to focus on. We offer flashcards with additional bells and whistles, plus even more ways to practice retrieval. Awesome. So the next slide, we want to kind of show you an example there. So if you think about, we just talked about testing is learning, and we talked about how we want to do retrieval practice. Flashcards is a good way of doing this, but doing it in a specific way. So we want to help you, show you a way that you can teach your students to use flashcards that really optimizes and maximizes that testing and as learning focus that we're trying to discuss. So we have a flashcard here on the left that's showing you flowers. And obviously, you know, in Quizlet, you click on that and it flips over and you see the other side. Now, what we want you to tell your students to do is to have a pause there, to really, you know, try and pause before you retrieve anything that you can remember. Only then should you click on the card to flip it. And then, because if you flip too soon, you might recognize the answer and feel like you know it, but fail to remember it later. So it's really that pausing to retrieve that's really makes flashcards successful with the new learning science. All right, so retrieval practice with test and learn. So we talked about flashcards as one study mode. Now we want to talk about the two other study modes that we have at Quizlet, learn and test. And so learn and test both have flexibility to how your students can practice retrieval. For starters, you can test yourself with multiple choice questions. So you see here on the left, we've got a screen that shows practicing multiple choice questions. These are handy for various reasons. In order for them to be great at practicing retrieval, what you want to tell them to do first is to look at the picture and not actually look at multiple choice and see if they can retrieve that information before they try and guess. Because then when you look at the answer choices, again, you might just recognize or guess the right answer. For example, when you look at this picture that we have here, you might think that, okay, so I'm not exactly sure what it is, but when I look at it, okay, I see artichoke. It looks like an artichoke. I don't actually know anything about thistles or pines or nutmegs, but it looks like an artichoke, so I'm going to go with that. And so again, you kind of just did a guessing there rather than practicing retrieval. So on the other hand, the other type of question that we have is written questions. Written questions do force you to retrieve the right answer. This is like effortful retrieval practice. Okay, so next slide. So then you might wonder, okay, so then why don't we always just do written questions then? What is the value of doing these other types of practice? So retrieval practice should engage the same processes a student will use on test day. So if you give multiple choice tests, or they will experience a multiple choice test, either in, you know, something like you're practicing for an AP exam or, you know, a standardized test, you want them to simulate that real test. So that's why you might want them to do multiple choice. So when you go into learn or test mode, you can actually select the type of questions that you want to practice with. So if your students are preparing for a multiple choice quiz, what we're trying to show here on the screen is that you can select, if you go into test mode, you can select just multiple choice questions so that they are practicing, simulating, and doing retrieval practice in the way that they will be tested. So look for that when you go to test mode. Talk to them about going down to the options. Sometimes it's at the way bottom of the screen. Click options and select multiple choice if that's what your test is going to be about. That being said, if students need to hold on information for a long time, they should practice both the test format and the most effortful possible retrieval format. Again, so if this is like, I just need them to, they need to learn this for a really long time, or they're going to have a final way ahead of in the future, practicing both the test format and the most effortful retrieval format is the best way to do it. So they might do multiple rounds of multiple choice questions, followed by some written questions. And again, this is why we do this in the learn mode that you'll see, because it helps retain them what they learn better. Okay, awesome. Handing it off to Anna.
Great. So you might be wondering at this point, is retrieval just another way to review? We've been going on and on about retrieval practice, but is it really any more beneficial than just doing extra rounds of traditional review and using your time that way? Spoiler, the answer is yes, it is actually better than just going with traditional review. Otherwise, we wouldn't be wasting your time talking about it. So in one experiment, research participants were brought into the lab to learn vocab. And so what you see on this graph here on the y-axis is how well they did on a vocab test. And the stark difference that you can notice in this chart is these two tall bars on the left, which reflect students who were in a learning condition where they actually did multiple rounds of retrieval practice, and the two lower bars on the right, which were learning conditions where students didn't do retrieval practice. They just retrieved a vocab word and its translation once, and then they stopped. They didn't practice retrieving. And there's a stark difference in the scores that they got on this vocab test. So huge learning benefit from repeatedly testing yourself. But surprisingly, and kind of counterintuitively to a lot of us, there was no difference between those students who kept restudying terms. They weren't practicing retrieval, they were just re-reviewing the same content more passively. That's these bars in light blue. So there's no difference between their test scores and those of the students who stopped restudying altogether. They just got one vocab term right once and didn't restudy it further. So really counterintuitive. All of us would think that even passively restudying material should give rise to better test results. In this case, no difference there. The entire learning benefit came from repeatedly testing yourself, actively retrieving. So not only is retrieval practice as good as continuing to spend time reviewing and restudying, it's actually much better. Even in cases where there's no learning benefit from spending more time reviewing, there's a huge learning benefit from practicing that retrieval. So with that, let's take a low stakes pop quiz. I'm going to read this question. Feel free to answer in the chat or just to yourself and keep your answer in mind. So after teaching students the names of the branches of the US government and what each of them does, which would be the most effective way a teacher could help their students remember this information? A, have students read the facts for 10 days at the beginning of class. B, have students copy the facts into a notebook where they can reference them as needed. C, have students take a once-a-week quiz for 10 weeks where they recall the facts from memory. Have students participate in a review game where they have to recall the facts from memory several times in one class period. D. So which do you think it is?
Okay, looks like we've got lots of D's and C's here. So it's one of those, I think the teachers think.
Great, that's exactly what I would hope that you would think, particularly since we just covered the relevant concept. So C and D are both great answers, but it turns out that C is the best answer. So this survey was given to a group of teachers in training, and only 13% of those future teachers said that C was the correct answer. So both C and D feature retrieval practice. What is it that makes C a better option than D? Well, there's this simple fact that learning fades over time. When you first learn some material, there's a rapid decay, a rapid drop-off in that memory strength from the material you just learned. You're not going to be able to remember it as easily one day after you learn the material as you were on the day when you were initially learning it. But there is one trick that you can add to retrieval practice to slow that decay down and to help yourself remember material for longer periods of time. And that trick some of you also mentioned at the beginning of this talk, it's spaced review. So if you space your retrieval practice, you wait a day, then you wait 2 more days, and then a handful more days, and you keep doing retrieval practice each of those times, that is gradually going to slow down that fading of your memory over time. So you'll hold on to that information longer and longer the more you space out these retrieval practices. And so that's why answer C was better than answer D. On answer D, you were really just doing 1 day of retrieval practice. You were doing a lot of it, but just once on 1 day, and you didn't allow memories to slowly fade over time so that you could kind of do another dose of retrieval practice at just the right moment. On the other hand, if you say played Quizlet live once every week to re-review that material briefly, but regularly spaced out over time, then your students would be much more likely to do well on a cumulative exam at the end of the quarter, on an AP exam at the end of the year, etc. So key message, really space out retrieval practice. In the lab, when students were given some material and they were asked to space out their review of half of that material and cram or mask their review of another batch of material, 78% of them, the vast majority, did better on the material that they spaced out their retrieval practice. So doing much better. Again, get those Quizlet live sessions spaced out. Don't just devote an entire day of class reviewing the same material over and over. Spread it out. And what's really interesting about this finding is that it's also likely underutilized for an interesting reason. It's kind of hard to sense that it's working for you. So in this experiment where there was this stark difference in how well people did on a test after spacing out their practice, only 22% of students actually thought that they had done better by spacing review. And that's after they got their grades back, they got the feedback, they knew that what material they did better on. They still had a really hard time understanding that that was linked to that spaced practice. It's really counterintuitive. Okay, so that brings me to my next question. Is it just something about spaced retrieval practice that's kind of difficult for us to grasp and sense? Or is it a more general kind of finding that it's kind of hard to figure out how learning works on an individual level and figure out what works for me and what doesn't? So the data suggests that that's a more general case. The vast majority of students are not really adapting study strategies very intentionally. In fact, 80% of college students use study methods that they just intuited themselves. They tried something out and kind of stuck with it. In terms of time management, 59% of students reported they just study whatever's due next. They don't really think about when to schedule their studying, how to best space it out. In fact, only 11% of students actually schedule studying ahead of time at all. Again, the bulk of them just studying really kind of pragmatically, whatever's due next, I'm going to tackle. But do students want to learn how to learn? Is it that they just don't have access to the information or haven't been convinced yet of the right way, don't know how to try things out? We found on Quizlet that we think people do want to learn how to learn. So we ran an experiment earlier this year where we asked students to tell us what their learning goals are and get some guidance. We'll recommend a good way for them to study, a study strategy for them to adopt. And we found particularly that younger students were pretty likely to ask Quizlet for some study guidance. So if you look at this chart, the younger student is, the more likely they were to ask for some guidance, up to early high school, pretty likely. And then there was some drop off in college. So it looks like there were still some folks curious about some study tips, study strategies they could adopt in college, but perhaps college students are a little bit more in control of their own learning process. And that finding that we found on Quizlet actually mirrors academic research as well. So it's known that this concept, metacognition, which I'll explain in a second, usually develops in college. So it kind of develops out of necessity. When students need to be proactive, when they need to be self-disciplined, that's when they develop what are called metacognitive skills. These are the skills that allow them to unpack their own learning process. So they can kind of state and formalize what their learning goals are. They can develop plans to meet those learning goals, and they can sustain their own motivation levels so that they can keep chipping away at those goals for long periods of time. And again, this occurs largely during post-secondary education, particularly because there's less guidance from instructors there, right? There aren't teachers and there aren't parents providing 24/7 guidance on the study journey that students are going through in college. Which brings me to today's kind of reality. Remote learning means that this skill set needs to be trained, again, out of necessity, a lot earlier than is typical. Right now, students are much more on their own, right? Without being in a classroom with all of their wonderful teachers, with busy parents trying to hop on Zoom calls in the middle of the day, they're going to need to become masters of their own learning process, right? Just a little bit more. And this connects to recent research that was done trying to estimate what that degree of learning loss that comes from remote learning is going to look like in the fall. So I don't know if any of you have seen reports on this study, but it's really fascinating. So if you look at this graph, you'll see these colorful lines that are almost parallel that reflect different grade levels. And they reflect specifically how much learning gain is happening throughout the course of a school year for the students in these grade levels. And so you'll see that there's a positive slope. There's learning gain happening. People are learning more and more as each passing school day goes on. And then there's the school closure. And typically, when the usual school closure occurs in the summertime, it's natural for there to be a little bit of learning loss over the summer, and there needs to be a little bit of review to catch up at the beginning of the next school year in the fall. What this group of researchers did is modeled the effect of having an earlier school year, school closure due to the impact of the pandemic. So now school is closed mid-March. How is that going to impact us in the fall? How much learning loss are students going to have? And what their modeling showed is a range of possible outcomes, the most extreme of which were pretty striking. So they looked at reading and math learning loss, and they found that reading learning loss might be anywhere up to a third of material lost from the previous school year. And then math showed an even more striking potential for learning loss, up to 1/2 or even 2/3 learning loss of material learned in the previous school year. So they anticipate that math in particular is going to require a little bit of extra review and extra support in the coming school year. That being said, all students are probably going to need to be proactive and need to tackle those learning losses and bring with them some of these newfound metacognitive skills to direct their own learning and not just continue learning, but also catch up on the learning loss that they've already exhibited from the previous year. Furthermore, there's also this digital divide in access to technology based on the different backgrounds our individual students have. Some may have access to stable Wi-Fi and laptops so that they can do remote learning, but some don't. And that means catching up is going to be harder for some than for others. And that's going to be just as important to keep in mind as these overall trends are. Okay, so with that, I want to think about together how we can teach our students in the classroom to figure out how it is that they learn best. So what strategies have you already attempted or adopted in your own classroom? Is anything new coming to mind now that you want to try out? I want to do some brainstorming together, and then we'll give you some suggestions in a second.
Okay, so looking at the chat, waiting for some responses. How do you teach students to figure out how they learn best? Hands-on experiences, trial and error, ask students how they study and discuss study habits, and give them a survey, model and practice, layered curriculum. These are all really great suggestions. Can-do statements, I really like that. I think that echoes kind of the previous talk that we just heard. Group discussion, and ask them what they like to do, and flip the classroom, I like that. Self-assessment. These are all really great ideas about how you can figure out how they learn best and get them to be more independent at a younger age, especially right now. Great suggestions, everyone.
Great, thank you. keep those coming if anything else pops into your mind. All right, so what are some tips that we can offer you to help cultivate this self-driven, proactive learning in your students? One suggestion is really help students identify their own knowledge gaps at the start of the school year. So something really important for metacognition is to be able to figure out where you're at and figure out what strategies you should adopt to get to where you want to be, right? And so concretely, one thing you can do is assign some rounds of tests on Quizlet at the start of the school year and have students actually assess which questions they're getting right, which ones they're getting wrong, and summarize which concepts they think those questions reflect so that they can come to you with a report of which concepts need review. And that'll build that habit in where they don't just look at a score that they get on an exam in the future. They actually think about what's working for them, what isn't, what concepts they're grasping, which ones they're not. Another tip, individualize learning as much as is possible right now. So of course it's harder when you're not face-to-face with students, but there are some advantages that technology can offer. But probably the most important thing is to really empathize with the fact that everyone is handling the current situation differently and is just coming from a different place. And so hearing students, connecting with them on that front is probably the most important thing you can do. But in terms of their learning, there are some concrete steps you can take. So in particular, we'd recommend using Quizlet Learn because that actually allows each student to focus on their own specific learning goals. So everyone's coming from a different place. You don't want to spend student time necessarily lecturing everyone on the exact same material. You want to let them kind of focus in on what concepts they need to review, what concepts they need to spend more time on. And so something we really love about Learn is that it's really tailored to each unique student's studying and their own knowledge gaps.
Yeah, and I just want to really hone in on that. So that's, Anna, I love that you're bringing this up. So it's that if your students create an account on Quizlet, then we are adapting that learn mode as they go, but it will be individual for each of them. Again, so if you're looking for individualized learning, the learn mode in Quizlet, which is free, adapts to each student's progress and changes as they go. So it's, you know, almost a little bit of a one-on-one tutoring session to get exactly what they need. Have them go ahead and create an account, and then we can with the progress that they're making there, if they create an account and start using Learn, it will be very much individualized to what they need. So thanks, Anna, for pointing that out.
Great, thanks for adding that, Amanda. Okay, and then finally on the planning and time management front, have students plan out their time and monitor their progress. So concretely, assign them to set aside time for retrieval practice. That can look like live games with their classmates. It could also look like this more individualized learning using Learn mode or using test, but have them make it work for their own schedules and set a concrete time for the semester that works for them. And equally importantly, have them plan out time for reflection. So build in time, maybe at a slightly less frequent pace, but have them build in time for reflection on what it is that they like. They can share with their classmates, share what's working, what isn't, and adapt and use that trial and error to figure out what works, what doesn't, where to go next. All right, so with that, we really wish you the best of luck in the coming school year. We're obviously rooting for you all and so excited to see what creative solutions you come up with. We're going to be working at Quizlet on finding more learning science insights that we can bring to make easily adaptable to your classrooms. So stay tuned for those in the imminent future. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I see a lot of questions in here. Basically, I've been copying and pasting ones that I see that a lot of people are asking. So first of all, yes, this will be available later on. We'll think about maybe sending out the slides. I saw a lot of people asking that if we can have the slides. We'll talk to Chad about that. You know, some simple questions like get those through. What does spaced retrieval mean? Can you clarify retrieval versus passive review?
Yes, thank you so much for catching me on that. We should definitely reiterate. So retrieval, active effortful retrieval means really putting the effort into taking information lodged in your mind and pulling it out. versus passive review might just look like seeing a word in your notes in your textbook and thinking, oh, that looks familiar, I must know it. Does that help clarify? So having that kind of subjective sense of, yes, I know this, that's pretty passive. Active really means I could pull this out, I could write out the answer, and it would be right.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
Is it
then,
better to announce retrieval practice ahead of time or do it impromptu? What do you think? Does any research support either way?
I think both are fantastic, because something that is counterintuitive is even if you don't get things right when you're doing retrieval practice, it's still extremely beneficial. It's great if you can get the answer right. It's great if you have feedback too about whether you got the answer right or not. But even if you get it wrong, it's still beneficial for learning. Even if you don't end up getting feedback, it's still beneficial for learning. So it's a really flexible approach that will definitely work. And before I forget, there's also a question about what spacing retrieval practice actually looks like. So this is also actually a pretty flexible approach. It doesn't have to take one concrete formula, but it just means don't do all of your retrieval practice on one day. Do some practice one day, and then maybe wait another day and review that same material. And then if you can, maybe wait one more week and review that same material again. So building in those slightly longer gaps, not just 10 minutes, but on the order of days or even weeks. That's what is really going to boost that retention for the material you're trying to teach students.
Awesome. Okay, so Anna, do we set up the tests or are those tests built into Quizlet?
So the tests have a default that we set up. So by default, students will just see a mix of question types and there'll be 20 of them. But you can really easily customize it. So we were showing you there's just a little options button, and there you can customize how many questions you want your students to see, how many questions the students want to go through, and which question types they want to use.
Awesome. Yeah. So we just really encourage you, basically just, search on Quizlet or search through Google to get to Quizlet, get to that set and find the place where it says test. And if you click on that, you'll understand what we're talking about. It will bring up a study mode. Again, all of this part is free of Quizlet. It'll bring up a study mode, and you can kind of see how this looks like, and get that set up. So check out test mode. And learn mode. We think those are really great ones that we have. Anna, do you think, is there any research about whether the students should be making their own study sets or whether the teacher should just provide it and it's more about using the study modes? Any research that would help benefit either of those, what they should do?
Great, I love that question. That's something we think about a lot on the team because we do have so much content on Quizlet already and we can actually give students so much great material to study. So it's a question of, is it worth it to save the time making that material, or are there huge benefits from creating it? So the answer to that question lies entirely in how they're creating study sets and flashcards. Are they just copying over a sheet with terms and definitions that you've given them? If so, that's probably not going to do too much for their learning. You can probably just save everyone time and send out a link to the study set for them. But if they're doing some sort of distillation of information, organizing notes from a lecture, then it's really great to actually do that themselves and put it into this flashcard format on their own. Yeah, thank you so much for that question.
Cool. Okay, and then can you give a couple of practical tips on how to use Quizlet Learn to individualize learning? And I'll take this one. So again, if it already individualizes, that's how we designed it, and that's why we love our Quizlet Learn mode that we created a couple of years ago. Again, if you get your students to create an account and have them use the Learn mode, study with the Learn mode in using their account, we track their progress and we see how they're doing and we switch up the types of questions that they're getting, and we switch up the difficulty, if we need to ease up on it or make it more difficult. We also tell them kind of what they need to study next, which ones they've mastered versus which ones they've remembered. So the mode itself is individualized if you get your students to make an account there. It's already working from day one. So that's a great way to individualize learning, especially during this time when you guys can't be there for all of your students at every time. Okay, and I think that's all the questions we have. There's a lot coming in. But I think, I think that's what we're going to pause right there. Any last thoughts, Anna, that you want to share with the group?
I think that we really just want to make sure that you realize that there are these massive and often unseen benefits of doing that practice of pulling information from mind. And I hope that we've given you a lot of concrete ways that you can help your students practice that on Quizlet. Pretty much all of the ways to study on Quizlet are going to have that retrieval practice built in. And we hope that you take advantage of tools like Learn and like Test to fill some of the knowledge gaps that students are going to be coming in with in the coming year. And please reach out to us if you have further questions about how any of that fits together and works. We're happy to keep chatting, keep this conversation going.